The first thing Commander Sarah Chen noticed about the Zephyrian delegation was their silence. Not the respectful quiet of diplomats preparing for negotiation, but the heavy, suffocating silence of beings who had given up hope. They sat around the conference table like statues carved from despair, their pale blue skin dulled to an almost gray shade, their large eyes fixed on nothing. Sarah had spent 3 years learning their language, studying their culture, preparing for this moment. The Zephyrians were dying. Their homeworld, once a paradise of floating cities and crystal forests, was now a wasteland of toxic storms and poisoned earth. The war with the Korthak Empire had lasted 2 centuries, and the Zephyrians had lost everything except their lives. Honored delegates, Sarah began in perfect Zephyrian, her voice carrying the formal tones she had practiced countless times. The Human Federation offers sanctuary to your people. We have prepared settlements on 17 worlds, each carefully selected to match your environmental needs. The lead delegate, Elder Voss, barely lifted his head. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. We are grateful for your kindness, Commander Chen, but we are a broken people. Our children no longer sing the old songs. Our artists create nothing but monuments to loss. We accept your charity, but we fear we bring nothing but sorrow to your worlds. Sarah felt something twist in her chest. She had read the reports, seen the casualty numbers, understood the scale of the Zephyrian tragedy. But seeing these beings in person, watching the weight of genocide settle on their shoulders like a physical burden, made it real in a way that no briefing ever could. You bring yourselves, she said softly, abandoning the formal protocol. That's enough. Elder Voss looked up for the first time since entering the room. His eyes, pale as winter sky, searched her face. You do not understand, Commander. We are not the people we once were. The Korthak did not simply take our worlds. They took our future. Our children are born knowing only loss. They speak of death before they speak of dreams. The conference room fell silent except for the soft hum of the station's life support systems. Through the massive viewport, stars wheeled slowly past, distant and cold. Sarah thought of her own childhood, of summer afternoons in her grandmother's garden, of the sound of laughter echoing through suburban streets. She thought of what it might be like to grow up never knowing such simple joys. I want to show you something, she said suddenly, standing from her chair. The Zephyrian delegates exchanged glances, their translator chips working to convey not just her words but the subtle shift in her tone. Sarah led them through the corridors of Station Harmony, past the diplomatic quarters and meeting rooms, toward the civilian sections. The station was a marvel of human engineering, a massive rotating habitat that housed nearly 50,000 beings from dozens of species. But Sarah wasn't taking them to see the engineering marvels or the grand promenades. She led them to Sector 7, Level 12, where the families lived. The first thing they heard was laughter. High and bright and utterly carefree, it echoed down the corridor like music. Elder Voss stopped walking, his head tilted to one side as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Human children, Sarah said simply, playing. They rounded a corner and emerged into a small park, one of dozens scattered throughout the residential sections. It was nothing special by human standards, just a patch of real grass and carefully tended trees, with playground equipment scattered around and benches for parents to watch their children play. But for the Zephyrians, it might as well have been an alien landscape. A little girl, perhaps 6 years old, was chasing a boy who couldn't have been more than 4. They were shrieking with delight, their faces flushed with exertion and joy. Near the swings, an older boy was carefully teaching a toddler how to hold the chains, his voice patient and kind even though the toddler kept letting go and tumbling backward into the sand. They have no fear, whispered one of the younger delegates, a female whose name tag read Kira Neth. They run and fall and get up again without hesitation. Sarah nodded. That's what children do. They haven't learned to be afraid of falling yet. An older woman approached them, her gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, her clothes stained with what looked like finger paint. She smiled at Sarah and inclined her head politely to the Zephyrian delegation. Commander Chen, she said warmly, brought some visitors to see the chaos I see. Mrs. Patterson runs our primary education center, Sarah explained. She's been teaching children for 40 years across 8 different species. Mrs. Patterson's eyes softened as she looked at the Zephyrians. She had the kind of face that belonged in a children's book, all laugh lines and gentle expressions, but Sarah could see recognition in her eyes. This woman had seen refugees before. "Children are remarkable creatures," Mrs. Patterson said, addressing Elder Voss directly. "They adapt faster than we do. They forgive more easily. They find wonder in things we've forgotten how to see." She paused, watching as the little girl from earlier tripped and scraped her knee. For a moment, tears threatened, but then the boy she'd been chasing came back and helped her up, brushing the dirt from her hands with the serious concentration only children could manage. The tears disappeared, replaced by giggles. "We have no children here," said Elder Voss quietly. "The last younglings were born 3 cycles ago, and they—" He stopped, unable to continue. Sarah had read that report too. The last generation of Zephyrian children had been born in refugee camps, knowing only hunger and fear. Most had never learned to speak. They communicated in whispers and gestures, their natural telepathic abilities stunted by trauma. They were alive, but in some fundamental way, they had never truly been allowed to be children. "Where are they now?" Sarah asked gently. "Safe," Elder Voss replied. "Hidden in the deep ships, protected from everything, including us." The pain in his voice was almost unbearable. Mrs. Patterson stepped closer, her voice kind but firm. "Children aren't meant to be protected from everything, Elder Voss. They're meant to be protected so they can experience everything. There's a difference." Before Elder Voss could respond, the playground erupted in excited shouts. The children had discovered something wonderful, a small orange tabby cat that had wandered into their domain. They surrounded it carefully, their voices dropping to reverent whispers as they took turns gently petting its fur. "Is it hurt?" asked the little girl who had fallen earlier. "No," replied the older boy seriously. "I think it's just lost." Without hesitation, the children formed a small circle around the cat, protecting it from the overwhelming attention while still allowing it to feel safe. They had identified a vulnerable creature and immediately moved to care for it, not because anyone told them to, but because it was simply what they did. Elder Voss made a sound like a sob. "Our younglings were like that once," he whispered. "Before the war, before the fear, they would sing to the crystal flowers and the flowers would sing back. They would dance in the floating gardens and their laughter would make the very air shimmer with joy." "They can be like that again," said Mrs. Patterson simply. "Children are stronger than we think and more forgiving than we deserve." Sarah watched the Zephyrian delegates, saw the hunger in their eyes as they watched human children at play. It wasn't just nostalgia, she realized. It was hope, fragile and tentative, but undeniably real. "We have protocols," she said carefully, "for integration, educational support, psychological counseling, cultural preservation programs, but none of that works unless the children want to participate." Elder Voss turned to look at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, his eyes held something other than resignation. "What are you suggesting, Commander?" "I'm suggesting we ask them," Sarah replied. "Not you, not me, them, the younglings. I'm suggesting we give them a choice." The silence that followed was different from the silence in the conference room. This wasn't the silence of despair, but the silence of possibility, fragile and new and desperately important. Kira Neth stepped forward, her voice barely audible. "They have never been given choices, Commander, only commands. Stay hidden, stay quiet, stay safe. They don't know how to choose." Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile she'd worn all day. "Then I guess it's time they learned." As if summoned by her words, the little girl from the playground approached their group, the orange tabby cradled carefully in her arms. She looked up at the tall, silent Zephyrians with the fearless curiosity that only children possessed. "Are you sad?" she asked Elder Voss directly, her voice clear and concerned. "You look like my daddy did when Grandpa went to heaven." Elder Voss stared down at her, this small human child who had seen sadness and recognized it, and decided to simply ask about it. He knelt slowly until he was at her eye level, his hands shaking slightly. "Yes, little one," he said in careful English. "I am very sad, my people, we have lost our way." The girl considered this seriously, her small face scrunched in concentration. "Well," she said finally, "maybe you just need to find some new friends. Friends help you remember how to be happy." She held up the cat. "Like Mr. Whiskers here, he was lost, but now he's found." For a long moment, Elder Voss simply stared at her. Then slowly, carefully, he reached out and gently stroked the cat's fur. The tabby purred, a sound of pure contentment that seemed to fill the sudden quiet. When Elder Voss looked up at Sarah, tears were streaming down his pale blue cheeks, but his voice was steady. Commander Chen, I would like to discuss bringing our younglings to Station Harmony. Not to hide them, but to let them meet your children. To let them remember what it means to play. Sarah nodded, feeling something ease in her chest. We'll start with a small group, volunteers only, and Elder Voss. She paused until he met her eyes. They won't be Zephyrian children or human children here. They'll just be children, and children, as Mrs. Patterson said, are remarkable creatures. As they walked back toward the diplomatic section, the little girl's laughter echoing behind them, Sarah allowed herself to hope that this was just the beginning. The Zephyrians had lost their world, their culture, their future. But children had a way of creating new futures, often without anyone realizing it was happening. The real question wasn't whether the Zephyrian younglings could heal from their trauma. The real question was what kind of future they would build once they remembered how to dream. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in the shuttle bay of Station Harmony, watching the most important cargo transfer of her career. Through the reinforced transparisteel, she could see the Zephyrian transport vessel *Sorrow's End, docking with deliberate precision. The name alone told her everything she needed to know about the state of mind of its crew. Beside her, Mrs. Patterson adjusted the small translator device clipped to her collar and smoothed down her practical gray sweater. She had that look she got before meeting particularly challenging children, the expression of someone preparing to catch whatever was thrown at her, literally or figuratively. How many? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. 7 younglings, Elder Voss replied from behind them. His voice carried across the bay with the careful precision of someone who had practiced these words many times. The oldest is 12 standard years, the youngest barely 4. They have never been separated from the deep ships before. Sarah turned to study the Zephyrian elder's face. In the 3 weeks since their first meeting, he had changed. The gray pallor of his skin had warmed to a healthier blue, and his eyes no longer held quite so much resignation. But now, watching the transport dock with his people's most precious cargo aboard, he looked terrified. They chose to come, Sarah asked gently. They did not choose not to come, Elder Voss said carefully. When we told them about the human children, about the playing and the laughter, they simply listened. For the first time in cycles, they asked questions. The docking clamps engaged with a soft thud that reverberated through the deck plating. Sarah watched the status lights cycle from red to amber to green, marking the successful connection between 2 very different worlds. What kind of questions? Mrs. Patterson asked, her teacher instincts already engaged. Kira Neth, who had been quietly observing from the observation deck, descended the stairs to join them. Over the past weeks, she had become something of an informal liaison, her youth making her less intimidating to the younglings than the formal council of elders. Strange questions, Kira said softly. One asked if human children ever dream in colors. Another wanted to know if they make music when they are happy. The youngest, Zara, asked if human children ever sing to the stars. Sarah felt her throat tighten. These were the questions of children who had been denied childhood, who had observed life from a distance without being allowed to participate in it. The airlock cycled, and Sarah stepped forward as the first Zephyrian emerged from the transport. She had expected the adult escorts, the careful protocols, the formal presentations. What she hadn't expected was the profound silence that preceded them. Dr. Thane Morvek, the chief medical officer assigned to the young refugees, appeared first. His clinical reports had been thorough but dry, focusing on nutritional deficiencies and delayed development markers. Seeing him in person, Sarah understood why the younglings trusted him. He moved with the careful gentleness of someone accustomed to working with broken things. Commander, he said quietly, inclining his head. They are fragile, not physically, though they are smaller than they should be, emotionally. They startle at unexpected sounds, and they do not separate willingly from each other. How do they communicate? Mrs. Patterson asked. Primarily through low-level telepathic connection, Dr. Morvek explained. Their verbal skills are severely underdeveloped. Most have fewer than 50 words in any language. They understand far more than they can express. The airlock cycled again, and Sarah held her breath. The first youngling to emerge was clearly the oldest, a girl whose pale blue skin seemed almost translucent in the shuttle bay lighting. She wore simple gray clothing that hung loose on her thin frame, and her large eyes darted constantly around the space as if cataloging every possible threat. Behind her, 6 smaller forms clustered together like a school of frightened fish. They were beautiful and heartbreaking in equal measure. Zephyrian children were naturally slender, with elongated limbs and the characteristic large eyes that made them appear perpetually curious. But these children looked haunted, their natural grace replaced by a careful wariness that no child should ever need to learn. The oldest girl's gaze swept the shuttle bay and landed on Sarah. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then, to Sarah's surprise, the girl stepped forward and said something in heavily accented English. "Are you the one who protects the human younglings?" The words were carefully pronounced, as if she had been practicing them for weeks. Sarah knelt down to bring herself closer to the girl's eye level, remembering how Elder Voss had responded to the little girl in the park. "I'm Sarah," she said simply. "I help keep everyone safe here, including you. What's your name?" "Lyra," the girl replied. She gestured to the cluster of smaller children behind her. "I protect them, always." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward slowly, her movements careful and non-threatening. "That's a big responsibility for someone so young." Lyra's chin lifted with unmistakable pride. "I am oldest. It is my duty." Sarah exchanged a glance with Mrs. Patterson. They both recognized what they were seeing. This 12-year-old girl had been forced to become an adult, to take on responsibilities that should never have fallen to a child. The protective stance she maintained over the younger ones wasn't just instinct. It was learned behavior, hardened by necessity into an unshakable resolve. "Here," Mrs. Patterson said gently, "children are protected by adults. That's our job. Your job is to be a child." Lyra looked confused, as if the concept didn't translate properly. Behind her, the youngest of the group, who could only be little Zara, tugged at Lyra's sleeve and whispered something in rapid Zephyrian. "She wants to know," Lyra translated carefully, "if the human younglings will be angry that we are here." Sarah felt her heart break a little more. These children had been taught that they were burdens, that their very existence was something to apologize for. "No," Sarah said firmly. "They're excited to meet you. They've been preparing welcome gifts." As if summoned by her words, the far doors of the shuttle bay opened and a small group of human children entered, accompanied by 3 adults. Sarah recognized them from the park. The little girl who had found the cat, now carrying a carefully wrapped package, the older boy who had taught the toddler to swing, and several others, all walking with the barely contained excitement that marked children on their best behavior. The contrast was immediate and striking. The human children moved with confidence and curiosity, their voices cheerful as they chatted among themselves. The Zephyrian younglings pressed closer together, their silence becoming even more profound. "Hello," called the little girl from the park, her voice bright with genuine enthusiasm. "I'm Emma. Are you the new friends Sarah told us about?" Lyra stepped protectively in front of the younger children, but her posture wasn't entirely defensive. Sarah could see curiosity warring with caution in her expression. "These are human younglings?" Lyra asked Sarah quietly. "These are human children," Sarah confirmed, "just like you are Zephyrian children." Emma approached slowly, her package held out in front of her like an offering. "We made you welcome presents," she announced. "Mrs. Patterson helped us pick things you might like." One of the Zephyrian children, a boy who looked about 8, whispered something to Lyra. She translated hesitantly. "Kale wants to know why they would give us gifts. We have done nothing for them." "Because that's what friends do," replied the older human boy, stepping forward with a grin. "I'm Marcus, and you don't have to do anything to be our friend except, be our friend." The simplicity of the statement seemed to confuse the Zephyrian children more than complex explanations might have. They conferred among themselves in rapid, whispered Zephyrian, their telepathic connection creating an almost visible bond between them. Mrs. Patterson moved closer to Sarah. "They've never experienced unconditional kindness," she murmured. "Everything in their lives has been transactional, survival for obedience, safety for silence." Emma, undeterred by the language barrier or the obvious uncertainty of the Zephyrian children, simply sat down on the deck and began unwrapping her package. "Look," she said, holding up a small stuffed animal, a brown teddy bear with a red ribbon around its neck. "This is for anyone who gets scared at night. He's really good at keeping nightmares away." Little Zara peered around Lyra's protective form, her large eyes fixed on the teddy bear with unmistakable longing. Marcus unpacked his own gift, a collection of art supplies. "These are for making pictures," he explained. "You can draw anything you want, happy things, sad things, made-up things, whatever's in your head." A Zephyrian girl who appeared to be about 10 reached out tentatively toward the art supplies, then quickly pulled her hand back when Lyra made a small sound of warning. "It's okay," said another human child, a girl of perhaps 9 with dark curls and a gap-toothed smile. "You can touch them. They're yours if you want them." Dr. Morvek stepped forward carefully. "Lyra," he said in Zephyrian, then switched to English. "The human children wish to share their possessions with you. This is a form of friendship offering." Lyra looked from the gifts to the human children to Sarah, her expression clearly calculating risks and benefits with the grim efficiency of someone far too young to need such skills. "Are there conditions?" she asked finally. "What do they require in return?" Emma looked genuinely puzzled. "They don't require anything. That's not how presents work." "All things have costs," Lyra replied carefully. "We have learned this." Mrs. Patterson knelt down beside Emma, her voice gentle but clear. "Some things do have costs, Lyra, but friendship shouldn't be one of them. The only thing these children want in return is the chance to be your friends." Zara whispered something urgent to Lyra, tugging on her sleeve with tiny hands. Lyra listened, then looked back at the human children with something that might have been hope struggling against lifelong caution. "The little one asks," Lyra said slowly, "if friendship means we can play together." Marcus nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly what it means. Do you know any games?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. The Zephyrian children looked at each other, their telepathic communication creating a moment of shared consultation that the humans couldn't hear but could clearly sense. Finally, the boy called Kale stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper. "We know hiding games. We are very good at hiding." Sarah felt her eyes burn with sudden tears. Of course they knew hiding games. They had spent their entire lives learning to hide, to disappear, to make themselves small and unnoticeable and safe. "Those are good games," Emma said seriously. "But we know other games too, running games and laughing games and singing games. Would you like to learn some?" Zara broke away from the group suddenly, taking 3 quick steps toward Emma before stopping, her small hands reaching toward the teddy bear with undisguised want. Lyra moved to intercept, but Emma was faster. She held out the bear with a smile. "He's yours," she said simply. "His name is Mr. Snuggles, but you can call him whatever you like." Zara took the bear with reverent care, holding it against her chest as if it were made of spun glass. When she looked up at Emma, her large eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered in English, the words carefully pronounced. Then so quietly that only the closest observers could hear, she added, "He is beautiful." Emma beamed. "You're beautiful too," she replied matter-of-factly. "All of you are. Mrs. Patterson says beautiful is something you are, not something you have to earn." Lyra stared at Emma with the expression of someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "You believe this?" "I know this," Emma corrected gently. "Just like I know we're going to be really good friends." For the first time since emerging from the transport, Lyra smiled. It was small and uncertain, like a flower blooming in unlikely soil, but it was real. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "we could learn some of your games." And in that moment, Sarah understood that this was how worlds changed. Not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through children who offered teddy bears and friendship without conditions, and other children who were brave enough to accept both. 2 months into what Station Harmony's education department had optimistically labeled the Cultural Integration Program, Sarah found herself standing in the observation deck of Learning Center 7 at 600 hours, watching something unprecedented unfold in the classroom below. Lyra sat at a child-sized table, her pale blue fingers carefully gripping a yellow crayon as she worked on what appeared to be her first truly artistic creation. Around her, human and Zephyrian children worked together on individual art projects, their voices creating a gentle murmur of concentration and occasional bursts of delighted laughter. The transformation had not been smooth. The first weeks had been marked by tears, misunderstandings, and moments of heartbreaking revelation about just how much the Zephyrian children had lost. But children, Sarah had learned, were remarkably resilient when given the right environment to heal. "She's drawing the floating gardens of Zephyr Prime," said Dr. Morvek quietly, joining Sarah at the observation window. "From memory, She couldn't have been more than 4 when they were destroyed, but the detail is extraordinary. Sarah studied the drawing taking shape under Lyra's careful attention. Delicate spires of crystal and living light rose from what appeared to be clouds, while small figures danced among structures that defied gravity and logic. It was beautiful and heartbreaking and hopeful all at once. The human children asked her to draw her home, Dr. Morveck continued. Not the refugee ships or the hiding places, but her real home, the place she remembered from before. Below them, Emma leaned over Lyra's shoulder, her own picture forgot as she studied the older girl's work with obvious fascination. "That looks like a castle in the sky," Emma said, her voice clearly audible through the room's audio system. "Did you really live up there?" Lyra paused in her coloring, her expression thoughtful. Over the past weeks, her English had improved dramatically, her natural intelligence finally given the resources it needed to flourish. "It was not a castle," she said carefully. "It was a city that sang. The crystal towers would catch the wind and make music, and when the younglings laughed, the whole city would glow brighter." Marcus looked up from his own picture, which appeared to be a detailed spacecraft engaged in what looked like an epic battle. What happened to it? The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. This was dangerous territory, Sarah knew. The human children had been carefully briefed about the Zephyrian tragedy, but in age-appropriate terms that focused on the loss of home rather than the horrific details of genocide. Lyra set down her crayon and looked around the table at the expectant faces of her new friends. When she spoke, her voice carried a gravity that no 12-year-old should ever need to master. "Bad people came," she said simply. "They were angry because we were different. They broke our beautiful things and tried to break us too." Zara, who had barely spoken a word for the first month of the program, suddenly looked up from her own drawing. She had been working on what appeared to be a portrait of her teddy bear, Mr. Snuggles, surrounded by an elaborate garden of multicolored flowers. "But they didn't break us," she said clearly, her small voice carrying surprising strength. "We're still here." The table fell silent. Even the background chatter of other groups seemed to fade as the weight of little Zara's words settled over the room. Emma reached across the table and took Zara's hand with the unconscious kindness that had become her trademark. "Of course you're still here," she said matter-of-factly. "You're our friends. Friends don't let friends get broken." Kale, who had been the most withdrawn of all the Zephyrian children, suddenly spoke up. "What if we are already broken?" It was perhaps the most devastating question Sarah had ever heard a child ask, and it was delivered with the casual acceptance of someone stating an obvious fact. Mrs. Patterson, who had been quietly moving between tables, appeared beside Kale's chair with the quiet efficiency she had perfected over 4 decades of teaching. She knelt down to his eye level, her expression serious but gentle. "Tell me, Kale," she said softly, "can broken things still learn new games?" Kale considered this carefully. "I do not know, maybe." "Can broken things still laugh when their friends tell funny jokes?" A small smile tugged at the corner of Kale's mouth. "Yes, I have laughed. Yesterday when Marcus fell in the mud puddle and made the funny noise." "Can broken things still feel happy when they draw pictures of beautiful places?" Kale glanced down at his own artwork, a swirling pattern of blues and purples that seemed to move even though it was perfectly still on the paper. "Yes," he said quietly. "This makes me feel warm inside." Mrs. Patterson nodded seriously. "Then maybe you're not broken, Kale. Maybe you're just hurt, and hurt things can heal when they're given the right care." From across the table, Marcus leaned forward with the earnest intensity that marked his most important pronouncements. "Besides, if you were broken, we'd fix you. That's what friends do. They fix each other." Lyra looked at Marcus with the expression of someone encountering an entirely foreign concept. "You would fix us." "We'd help you fix yourselves," Emma corrected with the wisdom of someone who had clearly been taught the difference. "Nobody can fix anybody else, but friends can help. Like when you fall down and hurt your knee, I can't make it not hurt, but I can help you clean it up and put a bandage on it and stay with you until it feels better." The Zephyrian children exchanged glances, their telepathic communication creating that familiar moment of silent consultation. Sarah had learned to recognize these exchanges as their way of processing concepts too large or strange for individual consideration. "We do not understand," said Neera, one of the middle children who rarely spoke but whose artwork showed remarkable sophistication. Among our people, broken things were hidden away. Protected, yes, but also separated. You keep broken things close. Our things aren't broken, said a new voice from the doorway. Sarah turned to see Tommy Nakamura, a 10-year-old whose mother worked in the station's engineering department. He was carrying a strange contraption that appeared to be part robot, part artwork, and entirely unique. They're just different. Tommy approached the table and set down his creation with obvious pride. This is my robot, Mr. Fixes It. He's made out of broken parts from the repair shop, but he's not broken. He's just remixed. The robot was indeed assembled from discarded components, but with an artistic sensibility that transformed the mechanical detritus into something oddly beautiful. LED lights blinked in seemingly random patterns, and small mechanical arms moved in what might have been dance or might have been malfunction. He doesn't work like other robots, Tommy continued. He can't do math or lift heavy things or any of the normal robot stuff, but watch this. Tommy pressed a button on the robot's side, and suddenly the classroom filled with music. Not recorded music, but something entirely original, a melody created by the robot's mechanical movements and electronic components. It was strange and beautiful and unlike anything Sarah had ever heard. He makes music out of broken parts, Tommy explained proudly, because sometimes the best things come from putting broken pieces together in new ways. Zara stood up from her chair and approached the robot with obvious fascination. He is beautiful, she whispered, then looked up at Tommy with large, wondering eyes. You made beauty from broken things. I made something new from old things, Tommy corrected gently. And yeah, I think it's beautiful too. Kale reached out tentatively to touch one of the robot's gently moving arms. We are old things, he said quietly. From a place that is gone, could we become new things? The question was directed at Tommy, but it was Mrs. Patterson who answered. You're already becoming new things, Kale. Every day, every new friend you make, every game you learn, every picture you draw. You're not forgetting what you were, but you're becoming more than you were. Lyra had been listening to this exchange with the focused attention she brought to all new concepts. Now she looked around the table at the human children who had somehow become her friends, her large eyes bright with something that might have been understanding. The human younglings, she said carefully, you do not try to make us the same as you. Why would we do that? Emma asked, genuinely puzzled. Same is boring, different is interesting. Among our people, Lyra continued, before the war there was a saying. The crystal that resonates alone makes only one note, but crystals that resonate together make symphonies. We had forgotten this saying, until now. Marcus grinned. So we're like a symphony, that's cool, what note are you? Lyra thought about this seriously, then smiled. I think I am learning to find out. At that moment, little Zara did something that would be talked about in Station Harmony's education department for years to come. She walked over to the classroom's music corner, picked up a small xylophone, and began to play a simple melody. It wasn't a human song or a traditional Zephyrian crystal song, but something entirely new, a bridge between two musical traditions that had never met before. One by one, the other children joined in. Marcus grabbed a pair of rhythm sticks, Emma found a small drum, and even Kale picked up a triangle, his movements tentative but purposeful. The Zephyrian children contributed their own vocalizations, wordless harmonies that wove through the instrumental music like threads of light. What emerged was chaos by any conventional musical standard, but it was joyful chaos, creative chaos, the kind of chaos that children created when they were allowed to simply be children together. Sarah watched from the observation deck as Dr. Morvek wiped tears from his eyes. They're singing, he whispered. For the first time since the evacuation, they're actually singing. Below them, Mrs. Patterson had joined the impromptu orchestra, her voice adding a gentle alto harmony that somehow brought all the disparate elements together into something approaching actual music. But it was what happened next that made Sarah understand the true significance of the moment. As the song reached what might have been its climax, Zara suddenly stopped playing and walked over to the classroom's communication terminal. Without asking permission, she activated the station-wide intercom and spoke into it with the clear, confident voice of a child who had finally found her courage. Hello, Station Harmony, she said, her English now nearly perfect. This is Zara. I am a Zephyrian youngling, and I want to say thank you. Thank you for teaching us that broken things can become beautiful things. Thank you for showing us that different notes can make music together. Thank you for reminding us how to sing. She paused, looking around the classroom at the faces of her friends, both human and Zephyrian. We were afraid you would not want us here because we are sad and broken and different. But you have shown us that sad things can become happy things, and broken things can become strong things, and different things can become friend things. Her voice grew stronger, more confident. We do not know what we will become, but we know we will become it together, and that is the most beautiful song of all. As the intercom clicked off, Sarah realized that she was witnessing more than just a successful integration program. She was watching the birth of something entirely new, a generation that would grow up knowing not just that diversity was tolerable, but that it was the very foundation of beauty itself. And in the classroom below, human and Zephyrian children continued their chaotic, joyful symphony, creating something that had never existed before and would never be exactly replicated again. It was, Sarah thought, the most hopeful sound she had ever heard. 6 months after the integration program began, Sarah stood in the main council chamber facing the most important gathering in Station Harmony's history. Representatives from 17 different species filled the curved amphitheater, their various forms creating a tapestry of galactic diversity that would have been unthinkable just decades earlier. At the center of it all sat the Galactic Integration Council, the body responsible for setting refugee policy across human space. The reason for this unprecedented gathering was simple. Other species wanted to know what humanity had done to achieve the impossible. "Commander Chen," said Counselor Vorthen, a Cree whose insected features were particularly intimidating in the chamber's formal lighting. "The reports from your station are difficult to believe. You claim to have successfully integrated traumatized Zephyrian younglings into human society within a matter of months. Our own attempts at similar programs have resulted in failure rates exceeding 90%. Sarah nodded respectfully. "That's correct, Counselor, though I should clarify that we didn't integrate them into human society. We created something new together." "Semantics," snapped Counselor Reth, a Drakmarian whose reptilian appearance matched her dismissive tone. "The fact remains that every species in this chamber has attempted refugee integration programs. Most result in cultural dissolution or psychological breakdown. The few successes require generations to achieve basic social functionality." Ambassador Kellyan of the Vorth Confederacy leaned forward, her crystalline features refracting the chamber's light into prismatic patterns. "The Zephyrian situation is particularly tragic because of the complexity of their trauma. Total cultural destruction, massive population loss, and younglings who had never experienced normal childhood development. By all psychological models, these should be impossible cases. Which is why," added Counselor Vorthen, "we require practical demonstration of your methods. Show us what you have accomplished, and perhaps we can replicate it for the millions of other refugees currently warehoused in holding facilities across the sector." Sarah felt the weight of the moment. In orbital facilities and refugee camps throughout human space, children of dozens of species were growing up in conditions that barely qualified as life. If Station Harmony's approach could be scaled up, it might change everything. "I'd like to begin," Sarah said, "by introducing you to our actual experts on integration." The chamber's main doors opened, and a small procession entered. But instead of the scientists and psychologists the council might have expected, the group consisted entirely of children. Human and Zephyrian, walking together with the easy familiarity of established friendship. Lyra led the group, her posture confident in a way that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. Beside her walked Emma, chattering quietly about something that was making both girls giggle. Behind them came Marcus, Kale, Zara, and a dozen others, their mixed voices creating a gentle background of cheerful conversation. The effect on the assembled dignitaries was immediate and profound. Whispered conversations died away as beings who had spent decades debating refugee policy found themselves face to face with children who seemed completely unaware that they represented anything other than themselves. "Honored counselors," Lyra said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics, "we are here to answer your questions about integration. But first, we have questions for you." This was not part of the planned presentation, and Sarah felt a moment of anxiety, but she had learned to trust these children's instincts. Counselor Vorthen's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement or irritation. Very well, youngling, what do you wish to ask? Zara stepped forward, clutching a small datapad with obvious importance. We have been studying the refugee facilities, she said, her clear voice carrying the precision that marked her as one of Mrs. Patterson's most dedicated students. We do not understand why the children are separated by species. The question was simple, but it cut to the heart of standard galactic refugee policy. Sarah watched as several counselors exchanged uncomfortable glances. Separation maintains cultural integrity, Counselor Reth replied stiffly. It prevents the loss of unique characteristics that define each species. But we have not lost our cultural integrity, Kale said, speaking up with the quiet confidence that had replaced his former withdrawal. I still know the old songs of my people. I still dream in the colors of Zephyr Prime, but now I also know human games and human stories. I am more than I was, not less. Emma nodded enthusiastically. And I know Zephyrian crystal singing now, and how to make that swirly art that looks like it moves. Learning about Kale's people didn't make me stop being human. It made me a human who knows more stuff. Ambassador Kellyan's crystalline form shifted, light patterns playing across her surface in what Sarah recognized as deep thought. You suggest that cultural mixing enhances rather than dilutes individual identity. We suggest, Marcus said with the earnest intensity that marked his most important pronouncements, that keeping kids alone is dumb. Kids need other kids. It doesn't matter what kind of kids they are. The blunt assessment sent a ripple of what might have been laughter through the chamber, but Counselor Vorthen's expression remained skeptical. And what of the psychological trauma? Our reports indicate that the Zephyrian younglings arrived with severe developmental delays and pathological fear responses. Lyra exchanged a glance with her friends, and Sarah recognized the silent communication that had become their trademark. We were broken, Lyra said simply. But being broken is not the same as being worthless. The human children taught us that broken things can become beautiful things if you have the right help. How? Counselor Reth demanded. Our psychologists have tried every known therapeutic approach. Most traumatized refugee children never achieve normal social functionality. Emma stepped forward, her gap-toothed grin bright with enthusiasm. We didn't use psychology, we used friendship. Friendship is not a therapeutic modality, Counselor Reth said dismissively. No, agreed Mrs. Patterson, entering the chamber with quiet authority. But it's the foundation that makes every other therapeutic modality actually work. Sarah felt relief flood through her as the teacher approached the children's group. Mrs. Patterson had insisted on being present for this demonstration, though not in the way the council had expected. Counselor Reth, Mrs. Patterson said respectfully, you're absolutely correct that friendship alone cannot heal severe trauma, but friendship creates the safe environment in which healing can occur. These children didn't recover because we had better therapy. They recovered because they were given what every child needs: unconditional acceptance, meaningful choices, and the opportunity to be valued for who they are rather than what they can produce. Unconditional acceptance, Ambassador Kellyan repeated thoughtfully. Most integration programs focus on adaptation requirements, behaviors the refugees must learn, standards they must meet, contributions they must make to earn their place. That's backwards, Zara said with the confidence of someone stating an obvious truth. Nobody should have to earn the right to be safe. Safety comes first, then everything else. Tommy Nakamura, who had been quietly setting up his musical robot in the chamber's center, looked up with a grin. Want to see what we've built together? Without waiting for permission, he activated Mr. Fix's. The robot began its familiar dance, mechanical arms moving in patterns that created music from the interaction of its various components. But this performance was different from what Sarah had witnessed in the classroom. As the robot began its melody, the children joined in. But they weren't simply making noise together. This was clearly a rehearsed composition, human instruments blending with Zephyrian vocalizations to create something that transcended both musical traditions. The song built slowly, each voice and instrument adding layers of complexity that somehow resolved into perfect harmony. The human children provided rhythmic foundation and melodic structure, while the Zephyrian younglings contributed ethereal harmonies that made the very air seem to shimmer. As the music swelled, Sarah noticed something extraordinary happening. The assembled dignitaries were not simply listening politely. They were affected. their various forms swaying slightly in unconscious response to the rhythm. Even Counselor Reth's rigid posture had softened. When the song ended, the chamber fell into profound silence. Sarah watched as beings who had spent their careers dealing with refugee crises as abstract policy problems struggled to process what they had just witnessed. "That was impossible," whispered Ambassador Kellyan. "Zephyrian crystal song requires precise telepathic coordination. Human children don't have telepathic abilities." "They don't need them," Lyra explained, her eyes bright with pride. "We learn to sing together without telepathy. We use our voices and our instruments and our hearts. It is a different kind of harmony, but it is still harmony." Counselor Vorthan's mandibles clicked rapidly. "How long did it take you to develop this level of musical integration?" 3 weeks, Emma replied cheerfully. "Once we figured out that music is just feelings that everybody can understand, the rest was easy." "Easy?" Counselor Reth repeated flatly. "You achieved in 3 weeks what our cultural integration specialists said would take years to accomplish, if it could be done at all." Marcus shrugged with the casual confidence of a child who had never been told something was impossible. "That's because your cultural integration specialists are thinking about it wrong. They're trying to make everybody the same. We just let everybody be themselves together." Dr. Morvek entered the chamber at that moment, carrying a substantial datapad loaded with what Sarah recognized as his latest research findings. "Counselor Vorthan," he said formally, "you requested quantifiable data on the psychological improvements observed in the Zephyrian younglings. I have prepared a comprehensive report." "Summarize," Counselor Vorthan commanded. "In 6 months, we have observed complete resolution of trauma-related sleep disorders, restoration of normal social interaction patterns, and development of linguistic abilities that exceed pre-trauma baselines. More significantly, we have documented the emergence of entirely new cognitive capabilities that appear to result from the cross-cultural interaction itself." "What kind of capabilities?" Ambassador Kellyan asked, her crystalline form shifting with obvious interest. Dr. Morvek consulted his datapad. "Enhanced pattern recognition, improved problem-solving flexibility, and what can only be described as intuitive understanding of cross-species communication dynamics. The human children show similar improvements, though to a lesser degree since they began from a higher baseline of social functionality." "They're making each other smarter," Mrs. Patterson translated with obvious pride. "When children from different cultures work together, they develop cognitive abilities that neither group would achieve in isolation." Kale stepped forward, his expression serious. "We have become more than we were," he said quietly. "Not because we stopped being Zephyrian, but because we learned to be Zephyrian in a bigger universe. And we learned that the universe is way more interesting when it has more kinds of people in it," added Emma. "Like, why would anyone want to live in a place where everybody was exactly the same?" Counselor Reth leaned back in her chair, her reptilian features revealing nothing of her thoughts. "What you describe contradicts every established principle of refugee integration. Cultural preservation requires separation. Psychological healing requires controlled environments. Social integration requires gradual, supervised exposure." "Maybe," Lyra said thoughtfully, "the problem is not with the refugees. Maybe the problem is with the principles." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah watched as the most powerful beings in the galaxy struggled with the possibility that their fundamental assumptions about refugee integration might be not just wrong, but actively harmful. Finally, Ambassador Kellyan spoke. "What would you recommend, younglings? If you were responsible for the millions of refugee children currently in our facilities, what would you do differently?" The children exchanged glances, their silent communication reaching a quick consensus. "Give them friends," Zara said simply. "All kinds of friends, and let them play together until they figure out how to be themselves together." "That's it?" Counselor Vorthan asked. "That's your solution to the greatest refugee crisis in galactic history?" Emma nodded cheerfully. "Yep, friends fix everything if you give them enough time." And looking around the chamber at the expressions of thoughtful consideration on the faces of beings who had never before considered that children might understand something about integration that adults had missed, Sarah began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were right. 1 year later, Sarah stood in the central plaza of New Harmony Station, watching the impossible become routine. Around her, children of 17 different species played together with the easy familiarity that had once been the exclusive domain of single-species communities. The playground equipment had been modified countless times to accommodate different physiologies, creating a wonderful chaos of adapted swings, climbing structures, and game areas that worked for beings with tentacles, wings, 4 legs, or traditional bipedal arrangements. But it was the sound that truly marked the transformation. The plaza rang with the music of children at play, their voices creating a symphony in dozens of languages that somehow resolved into perfect understanding. They had developed their own pigeon communication style that incorporated words, gestures, telepathic touches, and even chemical signals from the more exotic species. Mrs. Patterson called it playground diplomacy and noted that it was more effective than most formal translation protocols. "Commander Chen," said a familiar voice behind her. Sarah turned to find Elder Voss approaching, but the being she faced was dramatically different from the broken elder she had met 14 months ago. His skin had regained its healthy blue color, and his eyes held something that had been absent for so long she had forgotten what Zephyrian joy looked like. "Elder Voss," she replied warmly, "how are the preparations going?" "Beyond all expectations," he said, his voice carrying an enthusiasm that still surprised Sarah every time she heard it. "The first colony ships will depart next week with mixed families aboard, 17 species, all choosing to build new worlds together rather than rebuild their old ones separately." Sarah nodded, feeling a familiar swell of pride and amazement. The success of Station Harmony's integration program had led to something unprecedented in galactic history: voluntary multi-species colonization efforts. Refugee families were choosing to settle together, creating new communities that had never existed before. "And the children?" she asked. Elder Voss's expression grew even brighter. "They are excited. Lyra has been elected as the youth representative for Colony Ship 7. The human children call it President of the Kids, which she finds amusing." As if summoned by their conversation, Lyra herself appeared at the plaza's edge, leading a mixed group of children toward what appeared to be some kind of organized activity. She was 13 now, taller and more confident, but she still maintained the protective awareness that had marked her first days on the station. The difference was that now she protected not just Zephyrian younglings, but any child who needed looking after. "Commander," she called out, waving enthusiastically, "would you like to see our presentation for the colony ships?" Sarah glanced at Elder Voss, who nodded with obvious pride. Together, they followed the children to a cleared area where someone had set up what looked like a combination science fair, art exhibition, and musical venue. "We've been working on this for 3 months, Emma explained as she bounced up to join them. She was 8 now, gap tooth replaced by a proper smile, but her enthusiasm for new friends remained undimmed. "It's our gift for the people who are going to build new worlds." The presentation was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. At one station, Cale and Marcus had constructed a detailed model of what they called integrated architecture, buildings designed to work for multiple species simultaneously. The structures incorporated Zephyrian crystal song acoustics, human climate control, Vorth light refraction systems, and engineering principles borrowed from 6 other species. "Most buildings are designed for one kind of people," Marcus explained to Elder Voss, his 10-year-old face serious with importance. "But we figured out how to make buildings that work for everybody. See, if you put the Zephyrian resonance chambers here and the Kree nesting alcoves there, and the human social gathering spaces in the middle, everybody gets what they need and nobody has to live somewhere that feels wrong." At another station, Zara and a draconian youngling named Sketh had developed what they proudly announced as universal playground rules. Their poster was covered in drawings of various species engaged in modified versions of traditional games. "The problem," Zara explained with the confident authority that had replaced her former silence, "is that not everybody can run the same way or catch things the same way, but everybody wants to play, so we made new rules that work for everybody." Sarah studied their adaptations and found herself impressed by the sophisticated thinking involved. They had created modified tag games for species with different movement capabilities, ball games that worked for beings with tentacles instead of hands, and racing competitions that accounted for natural speed differences between species. "But the most important rule," added Sketh, whose reptilian features made his wide grin particularly charming, is that if somebody can't play, then we change the game until they can. Nobody sits out just because they're different. Mrs. Patterson appeared at Sarah's elbow, her face glowing with the satisfied expression of a teacher watching her students exceed every expectation. They've solved integration problems that have stumped sociologists for decades, she said quietly. And they did it because nobody told them it was supposed to be difficult. At the center of the presentation area, Tommy Nakamura had set up an evolved version of his musical robot, now incorporated into a larger installation that involved children from multiple species. As they watched, a young Vorth with crystalline appendages added light patterns to the robot's mechanical music, while a Cree Youngling contributed rhythmic clicking sounds that somehow perfectly complemented the melody. It's not just music anymore, Tommy explained proudly. It's a full sensory experience. We figured out how to make art that works for species that hear differently or see different colors or communicate through smell or touch. This way, everybody can enjoy it together. The demonstration that followed was extraordinary. The children had created something that was simultaneously music, visual art, aromatic composition, and tactile experience. Species that couldn't appreciate human music could enjoy the crystalline light patterns. Beings that couldn't see the visual components could participate through scent and vibration. It was genuinely inclusive art, created by children who had never been told that such things were impossible. This is remarkable, Elder Voss said softly. They have solved problems we didn't even know we had. But it was what happened next that truly demonstrated how far they had all come. A new arrival joined the group, a young being that Sarah didn't recognize. It appeared to be some kind of plant-based intelligence, with trailing vine appendages and a face that was barely distinguishable from the flowering patterns across its mobile trunk. It moved slowly and seemed to communicate primarily through chemical signals that most species couldn't detect. Sarah tensed slightly, recognizing this as the kind of moment that could test everything they had built. How would the children respond to someone truly alien, someone whose very mode of existence was foreign to their experience? She needn't have worried. Emma approached the newcomer with the same open curiosity she had shown to the Zephyrian children 14 months earlier. "Hi," she said cheerfully. "I'm Emma. Are you new here? Do you want to see our presentation?" The plant being's response was a subtle shift in coloration and a release of what Sarah's implants translated as cautious interest. But the children had learned to read more than just verbal communication. "They're a little scared," Lyra observed, her telepathic abilities apparently picking up emotional undertones that the translation system missed. "And they communicate mostly through scent." "Oh, cool," said Zara matter-of-factly. "Sketh's people use chemical signals too. Sketh, can you help translate?" What followed was a patient, collaborative effort to establish communication with the newcomer. The children drew pictures, used simple gestures, and enlisted Sketh's natural ability to interpret chemical communications. Within minutes, they had learned that the newcomer was named something that roughly translated as bright moss who seeks friends, and that they had traveled very far to find others like themselves. "There aren't any others like you here," Marcus said honestly. "But that's okay. There's only one of everybody here. That's what makes it interesting." Bright moss who seeks friends released another chemical signal that Sarah's implants struggled to translate, but the children's responses made its meaning clear. Somehow, they had managed to convey acceptance and welcome to a being whose very existence operated on principles foreign to their own experience. "You can play with us," Emma said simply. "We'll figure out how." And just like that, the impossible became routine again. As the presentation continued, Sarah found herself in conversation with other adults who had gathered to watch. Dr. Morvek was there, of course, documenting everything with scientific precision. But she was surprised to see Counselor Vorthen in the crowd, his insectoid features somehow managing to convey fascination despite their alien configuration. "Commander Chen," he said, approaching with careful steps, "I have been observing for 3 hours, and I confess myself mystified." "How so, Counselor?" "These children display more sophisticated integration capabilities than our trained diplomats. They solve communication problems in minutes that would take our experts weeks to address. They create inclusive solutions that our best social engineers cannot design. How is this possible?" Sarah watched as Brightmoss Who Seeks Friends was carefully incorporated into the musical presentation, their natural photosynthetic processes somehow adding a visual element that enhanced rather than disrupted the overall composition. "I think," she said slowly, "it's because they've never been told it's impossible. They start from the assumption that everyone belongs, and then they work backward to figure out how to make that true. While our diplomats start from the assumption that integration is difficult and work forward to manage the challenges," Counselor Vorthen mused. "Fascinating, and perhaps instructive." Mrs. Patterson joined their conversation, her expression thoughtful. "There's something else, though, something we're still learning to understand." "What's that?" Sarah asked. "They're not just solving integration problems," Mrs. Patterson replied. "They're evolving. The children who participate in these mixed-species communities develop cognitive capabilities that neither species would achieve in isolation. They're becoming something new." As if to demonstrate her point, Lyra approached their group with a question that illustrated exactly what Mrs. Patterson meant. "Commander Chen," she said, "we've been thinking about the colony ships and we have a proposal." "I'm listening." "The children want to create integration teams for each ship. Mixed-species groups whose job is to help solve problems that come up when different kinds of people try to live together." Sarah exchanged glances with Counselor Vorthen. "That's actually a very sophisticated organizational concept, Lyra." "Emma says it's just common sense," Lyra replied with a smile. "If you're going to live with lots of different people, you need some people whose job is to help everybody get along." "And you believe children should serve in this capacity?" Counselor Vorthen asked, his translator rendering his mandible clicks as mild skepticism. "Who else?" asked Zara, joining the conversation with the confidence that had replaced her former timidity. "Adults think about what's impossible. Children think about what's necessary." Counselor Vorthen stared at the small Zephyrian girl, his alien features somehow managing to convey profound consideration. "You are suggesting that integration policy should be determined by those who will live with its consequences, rather than those who design its implementation." "We're suggesting," Emma said, appearing with her usual perfect timing, "that people who are good at being friends should be the ones who help other people figure out how to be friends." It was, Sarah realized, the most elegantly simple solution to the galaxy's most complex social challenge. And it had been proposed by children who had spent the last year proving that friendship really could overcome almost any barrier. As the afternoon progressed and the presentation drew to a close, Sarah found herself watching something unprecedented in galactic history. Children from 17 species were planning the foundation of new worlds based not on the territorial and resource concerns that had driven colonization for millennia, but on the radical idea that everyone belonged, and it was simply a matter of figuring out how to make that work. "Commander," Elder Voss said quietly, approaching as the children began cleaning up their displays, "I have a question for you." "Of course." "When you first offered sanctuary to our people, you said we brought ourselves, and that was enough. Did you know then what we would become?" Sarah considered the question carefully, watching as Lyra carefully helped Brightmoss Who Seeks Friends understand how to fold up the display materials without damaging their delicate appendages. "I hoped," she said finally, "that you would become yourselves, all of you together. I had no idea how beautiful that would turn out to be." Elder Voss followed her gaze to where the children were working together with the unconscious cooperation that had become their trademark. "They have taught us something profound," he said, "that becoming more than we were does not require becoming less than we are." "And they've taught us," Sarah added, "that the question isn't whether different species can learn to coexist. The question is what amazing things they can accomplish when they stop trying to just coexist and start trying to truly live together." As the sun set through Station Harmony's great viewports, casting long shadows across the plaza where 17 species of children had just finished planning the future of galactic civilization, Sarah allowed herself a moment of profound satisfaction. They had started with refugees and children and the simple belief that everyone deserved a chance to belong. They had ended up with something that had never existed before, a generation that saw diversity not as a challenge to overcome, but as the raw material from which to build wonders. And in the gentle chaos of children helping each other clean up after a day of proving that the impossible was really just a matter of perspective, Sarah could hear the sound of a galaxy learning to sing in harmony.